Hello everyone, and thanks for joining webinar number 24, Best Practices for Building Websites in Kentico. My name is Neil Powers, and I've been with Kentico for the last 2.5 years, and I've worked with Kentico since version 1.9, which is a really long time ago, almost 6 years. What I wanted to do today is convey some of the best practices that provide faster development, lower costs, and better understanding of some of the features that take advantage of converting websites or developing a website in Kentico CMS. Through many consultations, I've listened to different groups and companies and peers talk about different features inside Kentico, and I wanted to clarify a few things in this webinar. There are many different ways to do things in Kentico. Some are better than others, and I wanted to just detail a few of those. Now, if you have any questions, it'd be better at the end of the presentation, but if you want to understand something more, and there is a question box in the chat window. In today's webinar's agenda, I wanted to talk about return of investment as far as Kentico developer styles, performance as it relates to content best practices, simplifying your project as a best practice for easier upgrades and patching later on, and then return on investment as far as Photoshop to content in about 4 steps, and simplifying your CSS for some of the CSS headaches and maintaining CSS, as our CSS file can grow quite large in many different sites. And then we'll have a chance for feedback and QA at the end of the webinar. Doing consulting for a number of years with Kentico, one of the top questions I get in consulting is related to Kentico development process. Because we have a lot of different ways to do things and we're flexible and we try to pertain to different shops, I get asked, what is portal development? What is ASPX template development? Is there a hybrid? Is there a way to do in between? Kentico's .NET, can we just use ASPX? Where is my design tab? The project was delivered and I don't have a way to go in and drag and drop things. So let's examine these briefly. The Kentico development methods, there's a lot of differences, and some of them are subtle and some of them are not. And why use one over another, and which is faster? So in looking at Kentico, there's a portal development where you typically use the UI to do almost all of your code and all of your generation through drag and drop and settings and properties within the actual content tree or within the different modules that we supply with Kentico. Another way to develop websites in Kentico, which is just as flexible, is ASPX templates, where you just open Studio and you write the code and you integrate a lot of our web parts and the settings of those web parts into the code itself. And with Kentico 6, we've actually introduced a new model, which is ASPX plus Portal, which allows you to have, say for instance, your site's template, your master page is written in ASPX templates, but still allow an area that the end user has a design tab and they can drag and drop different web parts within that template. So it's kind of a hybrid mix of both of best worlds. Now the differences are portal development, and the reason I use it most, is that the site is, at the end of the day, you're gonna deliver the site to the end user, and it's gonna go live. And what are they expecting? Did they see a demo in Kentico? Have they used the design tab? What are you gonna have at the end of the day for them to use? Site maintenance is more geared for non-technical users in portal development because it's very easy to open up a web part and change a setting. Code customizations via the UI and custom web parts are very easy, and that's typically how I do them. If I have to write some custom code, I will create a new web part or modify a web part and reintegrate it back into the system through a registration process in the site manager, and then reuse that web part within the confines that I have set it up for. To me, it's also faster site delivery for using an out-of-the-box common experience using portal development. And it's really, really good for learning how Kentico works on a non-technical level as well. So sites can still be as complex and as technical as ASPX builds. It's just an easier visual for a lot of different people. And I try to keep in mind, at the end of the day, who's this development for? Now, ASPX template development, I typically use on a case-by-case basis because sometimes you need it in certain instances that you just can't do inside the UI, or you can't do it in some other form, or maybe your shop is just used to writing code all the time, and that's what you like, and you don't like visual inheritance stuff. So to me, it's a little slower delivery time unless the team working on the project knows the API and components. It's completely flexible. It's just as flexible as doing portal development, and sometimes more so. The Kentico code is also very accessible. If you've ever opened up Kentico's solution, you'll see that a lot of the code is really there for you to edit and modify or to see how something works if you need to. Now, Typically, I'll use ASPX templates in situations that can't quite be done as custom web parts and modules because they're tying to third-party systems, or there's just some kind of functionality that can't be done otherwise. If you want to do ASPX template development, and you love writing your code by yourselves, this is the perfect model for you. Page templates equal physical files and are completely implemented by you, including the controls, the web parts, the settings, the usage, everything. Now, design and data structure changes are mostly done in Visual Studio versus the UI because you won't have a design tab in this mode. You won't have drag and drop, so if you want to add a web part to a page, it's all code-based. Now again, in version 6 and higher, ASPX plus Portal development is a big flexibility for editors because it combines the standard architecture and development process of ASPX templates, let's say for your master pages, and the flexibility of user-friendliness of the Portal engine for drag and drop capabilities inside the UI. Now, it also allows the design tab access to end users, but limited to exposed controls that you allow them. You can set up the page, you can edit a page or web part design via the UI and code changes, but instead of code changes that you might do in ASPX templates. So you could put a repeater on a page, you could set the properties inside the repeater in the UI, and you don't have to go back to the code to make simple changes that maybe change the sort order or something like that. It's a little more complex than Portal alone, and you must maintain a file system-based page templates to work this. However, and in some sites, going back to some sites, you can actually have to have two master pages, one for the UI to kind of represent what it will look like at the end of the day, and one for all of your file-based page templates. So those are sort of the key differences. To me, Portal development's typically faster, ASPX template development's a little slower, and ASPX plus Portal is sort of that more flexible in-between region. So at the end of the day, for me, when I work on a website or work with a client or work with a group building a website, I try to think of what the end goals are for the project or for the client. I try to consider the technical ability of the end user and make simple, what's the end user? Can they make simple changes without my help? Or do we have to be involved in the entire process for every single change the client wants? Every project and client is different, and Kentico is extremely flexible, as you might as well know. You've used it for a number of years. You're a partner. There really are no limits to any of the development processes between ASPX and Portal. They're just as flexible on either side. And you guys work on several Kentico projects, but the client you're delivering the site to will only maybe have that one project. You just never know. So let's go real quick into a demo and talk about development methods. So if we just looked at the ASPX template model straight out of the box, you would notice that basically if you wanted a repeater on a page to show a series of officers using a certain query, a transformation name and selected transformation, and what kind of item separator, you would actually have to key in the code itself in the back end, and the code or the code behind itself. You would always have to have that, maintain that code, that repeater. If you want two repeaters on a page, you actually have to go in and sort that out as well. Each one of these is going to involve bringing in a master and a template and bringing everything together just like you would on a standard ASPX project. But at the end of the day, what happens with the client is they don't have the capability to have a design view. So if we look here, there's no design tab. So if I want to change the sort order of this page or these two repeaters, I couldn't do it. I would have to actually go back to the code, change it, and push that code to the other servers that might be involved inside the environment. They could be dev, stage, production, even a web farm. It's a lot of code files that have to move around for such a simple change. So in the original Portal development, as you might as well know, you have this capability design tab, and you could easily take a repeater on this example e-commerce site and easily go in and make the changes yourself to a sort order or a query or a transformation. It's extremely easy to do, and at the end of the day, the clients can be trained and taught how to do this as well. Now, if we look at the Portal ASPX template model where it's combined, you actually get a design tab. And so let's flip over here real quick. And you see here that the master page is actually brought in, and it's just a ASPX templated master page. There's no way to change this code. It doesn't exist inside the UI. It's only part of that master page that's file-based. But because we're doing this hybrid, we can actually bring in a zone and actually have the capabilities of web part zones and widget zones, and actually allow the end users drag and drop capability within this environment. They can actually take and modify the settings of a text text area or a repeater or whatnot, and yet they still can't change the design of the site, just the section you give them access to. And to me, that's one of the main advantages I see of having that capability. Let's move on to content best practices. 3 of the most asked questions that I run into as a consultant, typically in the field, is how do I increase performance of Kentico? It's pretty fast as it is, but some people just want to increase it just a little bit more. And where do I store content in the system, or where does Kentico store content in the system? What is faster? What is better for me? And how do I enable versioning? To me, those are really important things to not only increasing the speed, but just an understanding of where these pieces are. So let's examine these briefly. Now, to me, one of the most overlooked content storage settings for performance is, do you store files in the file system? Do you store them in the database? And what does that redirect to disk piece do? So let's talk about these in detail. If you set up store files in the file system, it's considered best performance because you're pulling the files that are served, PDFs, images, and whatnot, right out of the file system. It, however, requires ASP.NET user modify rights for Kentico to be able to take care of those files and maintain them. It also does not offer full text search index for uploaded files. So what about storing files in the database? This is on by default. However, it's one of the worst performance pieces. It doesn't require ASP.NET user modify rights, which is good if you're hosting in a situation where you can't get rights on the box. And it also allows for full text search indexes of uploaded files, PDFs and whatnot, if you have your iFilter set up on SQL. So let's talk about that. How could you get both? Now, if you enable both of these settings, now remember, store files in the database is on by default and file system is off. But if you were to turn both of these on, it combines the advantages of both options. It gives you the same performance of the file system only option, but also allows for full text search index as well if it's set up and available. So it's kind of a really good thing to enable both of these on your website. Now, the next question I get asked is, how does it increase the database size? Well, it really depends on what you store inside Kentico. The file system is, if you store a lot of PDFs or videos or whatnot, just straight into the content tree, it's going to increase the database size as well because you're storing it in both places. So keep that in mind. Now, the other option I run into is redirect to disk. What is this? What does this mean? If I'm already storing it in the file system, why do I have to redirect to disk? Well, it increases the performance just a little bit, and the requests for files are redirected to the corresponding physical file if available. So if that file is uploaded into Kentico and it was in the database, and you requested it, and it puts it on the file system, or it's already there, then it's automatically going to redirect to disk first. So keep that in mind when you're setting up store files in the file system. It's also a good idea to turn on redirect to disk. Now let's talk about where these settings are. Now in Kentico, you have many different options and settings, but if we go to Settings, System, Performance, then Files, you actually have these two settings: store files in the file system, store files in the database, and these are on by default. This is how it's typically set. So if you were to enable these, any files you uploaded are now going to serve faster, but they're also going to be indexed by the search engine. So it's kind of nice. The other one in here is redirect to disk, and it's actually under performance, I believe. So here it is, redirect files to disk, and you turn this on as well. Hit save, and now your site's going to run a little bit faster. Now, as you can see here in version 6, there are some other options in here for gzip and caching and whatnot. And I definitely persuade you to go into the documentation and read about these as well. You can use the question mark here built in for the context-sensitive help, or you can open up the dev guide and actually comb through it. Now, where do I store content? Which is faster? There are actually 4 main ways to store content and assets in Kentico CMS. Media libraries, which serve up as media libraries. Content tree, which serves the files as cms.file documents. And app themes, which is basically unmanaged files. It would be a place you put possibly your entire design inside app themes, and some people just put a few icons that are repetitive, stuff that's unmanaged, things that the end user at the end of the day of the project, after it goes live, doesn't need to go in and modify and edit that often. And then, of course, there's attachments, grouped and ungrouped. They exist in the system, and they're considered document attachments. So it seems like there's a lot more different ways to store content in Kentico, but these are it. These are the 4 ways to do it. And from a performance point of view, let's review them next.
So the other side of it is, talking about this in a little bit more detail, is media libraries are pseudo-file-based. They still cause SQL queries to happen to access because there is some metadata stored with them. It has slightly better performance, but it's not the best performance. Media libraries can be staged, but file-level changes aren't tracked. So if your media library is on a share or it's on a FTP and somebody goes in and changes a bunch of files around, those changes are not reflected inside the staging tool that allows you to synchronize content from one environment to another, unless you go and make those changes inside of the UI. So once it's done in the UI, it does make those changes and records tasks that can be played forward for content staging to push information from one box to another. The other side is content tree. It's database-based. It depending on your settings. You could have it set for file-based for those files and assets and things. It has pretty good performance, but it does create about 3 queries to go fetch that content to look up information every time you show a picture out of the content tree. And if you have check permissions, that could be 4 or 5 queries. It really just depends on what you're doing to that content. So typically for me, I will create an assets folder on a website or an images folder and put very few things in there that are only related to content that I want the end user to go manipulate. That way I'm not, on a heavy hit site, I'm not beating up the box, creating a bunch of queries to the SQL server showing the logo or, the sidebar image or something like that. Those can actually be put in app themes or the media library at that. So as far as app themes go, it's IIS based. It doesn't create any queries. It's the best performance, and it's sometimes difficult for non-technical types because the editor who you've delivered this website to has no way to get to that app themes folder unless you give them FTP access or a share, or they have the server local to them somehow. So now, saying that, there is a way to go in and do some work inside app themes inside the system, but it's only for certain web parts, transformations, page templates, things like that, where you want to have certain types of content that go with that template or that. Now, as far as attachments go, attachments are file-based, but they rely on attachments are file-based, but they rely on the database. They have pretty good performance, but the files themselves are stored in a directory under, if you create a website called corporate site, there's going to be a folder called corporate site, and inside of that folder is a /files folder, or sometimes a /metafiles folder. And those files for attachments are actually stored in there, and that's why they're typically better performance because they come off the file system. However, because they are tied back to the database, they do generate queries and can create a little bit of performance hit. So they're not too bad, but they're still good performance. They're also accessible by the UI for ease, so unlike app themes, they're really easy to get to. So typically when I'm talking to clients or I'm building sites or I'm working on inside Kentico and converting a site, I look at what content they have now, or I look at what the content they're going to have based on the design. And I figure up that they have either, if they have a large amount of files, they have big video files that they didn't want to put on YouTube or something like that. They have common assets to many editors. They have 50 editors and they want to share this one big section of copyrighted, approved images, or they just want to use an image gallery. And I'll typically use that for a media library. As far as content tree, I'll typically, like I said, use that for various assets that I want the editors to have easy access to update, change, modify, and whatnot. So that way they can go change the corporate logo. They can go in and change an arrow that's tied into the navigation or something like that. And I've even gone so far as to create JavaScript sliders and WoW slider and whatnot that actually called up content from the content tree itself. So as the site progresses over the years, they can go in and change those slider images out fairly easily by just updating the content. I rarely use app themes except for either high performance sites that have a lot of traffic and need a lot of performance. But I'll typically put some assets in there that I don't want the content editors to have access to. And in some cases, that might be the entire master page's images that build up that design. So they don't need to change the design. I'll stick those images in app themes. I'll call them through the CSS that way, and everything's fine. I'll typically also call several images for web parts that need certain images. I'll call all those from app themes as well, just to save performance on the database and try to deliver that content as fast as possible. Now, as far as attachments, it simplifies the way you work, and in use when an attachment, when when used with workflow, as literally that document with attachments goes through its workflow lifecycle, those attachments go with it. So if you archive the document or someone doesn't approve of the document, none of those get published because they're all tied together with that one piece. It's quite an interesting little system, but it works very, very well. And I've used it quite a bit more often just because it's file-based, and it does seem to get a better performance than typically putting stuff in the content tree. So the other thing I want to bring up is a couple of best practices I run into where people out of the box have never gone in and turned on versioning without workflow. And when I'm developing or I'm going through and doing some staging work, I typically turn on, across the board versioning without workflow, just to have the capability, not in the object area, but in the content, that someone will goof up, some template. They'll goof up the layout. They'll goof up a content area. It could be as simple as accidentally deleting a web part, and poof, the whole site stops. We actually had a client yesterday who deleted their content placeholder on their master page. So suddenly every page looked really garbaged up, and they didn't know what happened. So, fortunately versioning was turned on, and we could roll that back with a couple of clicks, and the client was happy. So it's just one of those things that's not turned on by default. So the other side of versioning is that at the end of the day, when you've gone live, is you can let the end user roll back their own content if you give them access to certain areas of that versioning. It does create a little bit of a performance hit because it stores the extra, copy in the database, but it does allow you to store, restore, and compare versions of the document. So I wanted to show how to do that. It's really quite easy. When you're in Kentico, let's see here. Typically, all you have to do is go to your site manager when it's a website out of the box. And we click on development. And we go down to workflows. And there's typically one already built in there if you have like the corporate site or have ever had the corporate site. If you don't have any in here, you can always add a new one. But the settings for it out of the box are basically the big thing is automatically publish changes, so it doesn't require approval. And then you have your steps. Those are not editable when it's configured to automatically publish. But the one thing that's turned off is typically scope. So you pick your site, if it's a multi-site or a single site, and you basically set up what scope does this workflow look at. Now, I've set this one just temporarily to the root and everything. So it's going to basically version every single change of every single content item out there and just have a backup copy for forever and ever and ever until you hit that settings limit for versions. Now, if you're going into production and you have a big site and a lot of editors, you want to change this scope so that it more fits the content you want to archive, that they edit them more often versus actually changing the content across the board, because it can make your database quite large. If you set your versioning up to 50 versions and then you have 25 editors pounding out changes in the CMS all day long for weeks, it can be pretty big pretty quick. So it's just a very simple thing to do. Now the other side of it is you can also click on documents here, and you can see which documents are actually versioned and what version they are and are they published or not. Just gives you a quick overview. This actually comes out of the reporting system that's built into Kentico, so you can actually go in and even manipulate it if you wanted to. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is we typically run across when you're at the point of building a site, you're importing a site, you're bringing someone else's content in. Some partners have a multi-site where they have one physical build of Kentico and they might have 10 different domains in it, and they're the only editor. And if they just import a new site or bring up another corporate site without making sure that you've done some sort of safe measures and best practices to make sure your page templates and your web parts and your doc types aren't overwritten, then it can cause some panic in a lot of people because then the existing sites that were using those templates that were modified are now something else. And so in version 6 of Kentico, when we released it, the demo site that came with it actually does some of these best practices. And so I try to teach those whenever I'm talking to people who are going around and discussing how Kentico works. And so a couple of little things in here, like store page templates, custom web parts, and docs safely. So inside of Kentico, when you're working on page templates, let it spin up here. You actually have the ability of going in and creating a new category. So to give you an example, that's another site. And we'll go over here, load this one up. This one's the default corporate site. Sorry about that. So out of the box, Kentico has all these wonderful page templates and web parts and things, and you can just use them right out of the box. You can change them. The only thing is if you don't understand how Kentico's page template inheritance works, you can really mess up a bunch of pages really quick. So one of the best practices I tell people to do, and we do in the corporate site, community site, any of those starter kit sites, is to basically create a new category called like your site name or something, or your project name. And then in those, you'll see in this demo, you'll see several different website templates that are already built in there. Now, you say corporate site blogs, but there's already a blogs up here. Why can't I just use this one? Well, what happens is that you could use that one, but if you ever overwrite that one through an import or through a patch or something like that, then that design, those web part settings are basically null and void. They're put back to whatever that new version is or that new site you imported. But if you take these guys, once you've made a category, and you basically go in and you clone these, by basically modifying that template as an ad hoc and then saving it back into the corporate site folder as whatever name you want to give it, then automatically it sort of becomes that template for that site. And forever on, if I go in and import a site that originally had, this corporate site CMS blog template and code name, it's not going to affect the one that I had as a copy. So it's a very safe measure to kind of spend a little extra time when you're building these sites out and go through and create those extra parts. The same thing goes for document types. Although they don't have categories, I do tell people if they're going to create sort of one-offs, when they make them, make the CMS name something that's unique. So typically you'll see in here when you create new ones, you get custom. All of ours are CMS, and some of ours are e-commerce and stuff like that. It's just a best practice to make sure that you don't name something that is, if you didn't have a CMS FAQ and then you imported a site and it overwrote the one you had made, that would become kind of a weird little problem. The last part of that in best practices kind of safety is inside of web parts. Now, web parts, you can edit these web parts. You can look at the code. If we just picked, like, we want to modify the accordion layout, it works great for us, but we want to go into Studio and then enhance it and modify it and add features to it. We can easily go in and see, how this connects, what file it is, where it goes. We can open this guy up in Studio. We can set new settings to it. We can change the layout. We can set some custom CSS for that web part. We can go to the app themes accordion layout folder and upload some pictures maybe or something. It's a very easy way to do stuff. Now, if you modify the ones we have in the code level, that's fine. But if you import after the fact another corporate site, or you bring in someone else's site through an export-import procedure, and they also had an accordion layout named exactly the same, again, it's going to overwrite your code changes with theirs. So one of the recommended things here is, just like everything else, is create a category folder, and any one of these guys, let's say you're planning to modify accordion layout, you would just simply hit clone web part, and you would say, let's say, so we call it corporate site. Give it a little code name that's different than everything else. And we want to put it into we'll put it in the community folder for now because I don't have a corporate site. And what this will do once we hit clone is it'll actually make a copy of that file physically on the hard drive, but it also re-registers that new file and web part into the system under a new code name. So now you can go into Studio and open up this copy and modify all your heart's content, and an upgrade procedure or a patch or a site import will not overwrite that file unless it's exactly the same file, obviously. But it's just a safe procedure to go in and have that capability so that you don't get into a situation where you've wiped out your master page, you've wiped out several custom web parts that you built because you just modified the ones that were in there from Studio. So it's kind of an important thing as you're building out these sites to start thinking about where you're going to go with it. Where's it going to go from here? What's the next step? So as many of you know, that there's a lot of templates built into the system, and there's a capability to create sort of one-off templates and then modify them and then save them back. A lot of people don't understand that, and I've run into that quite often. So what we tell people as part of doing this process and you're developing the site and you're trying to think of ways to manipulate Kentico is that if you just go into the system and you were to pick a page and go to its design tab and just start changing settings, moving stuff around, well, what happens is that every single page in the entire site or a multi-site that's using corporate site partner as a template is now going to adopt that new look and feel. So let's say you just on Silver Partners, you wanted to change some of these web parts around, you wanted to add some web parts, maybe you want to change the layout, but you didn't want to affect other pages, or you wanted to find out what pages would be affected. One of the things you can do is go to Properties and Template, edit the template settings, and you could basically go in here and see how it's set up. You can see if there's any special settings or whatnot. But you can also go to Documents and see that this template is used on Gold Partners and Silver Partners. So had we gone and made some changes to it, it would have affected the Gold Partners page as well. And that would have been a problem. So in that case, what we can do is clone template as ad hoc, and it creates this one-off page that's a copy of that template. Then we can go in and edit the templates all day long, and we can see it's only going to affect the Silver page. We can add stuff to it. We can change the settings. We can go into that design view. We can do anything we want to that page and make it what we want it to be. And from that point, we can go to Properties and Template, and then either save as new template, basically putting it back in the system as a named template in a folder or a category that we've made, or we can just leave it as ad hoc if it's just a one-off page. For me, as in doing Kentico for a number of years, if it's just a one-off page in a site, I leave it. But if I need to go in and modify a template that's going to be used in 50 different areas, I'll ad hoc it, modify it, and then save it back as a named template so that it's easier to go in and reuse. So, and that goes back to looking at the site's design you're about to import, or the design you're about to bring on, or they have an existing site. I try to look at their site and figure out, well, what of their content is going to become, templates. And we worked with one client a while back, and they had about 60 templates that they figured out they had to have. And we sat down with them and showed them that because Kentico is dynamic and flexible, it really boils down to about 7 templates at the end of the day, plus a master page. And that kind of made their entire process of building their website a lot shorter and a lot faster because they didn't have to go create 70 different templates. They really only had to create 7, and then by using web parts and K-Sharp and some other stuff, they could just adjust for it, and it worked out pretty well for them. So one of the other things I run into is people not using doc types. They'll treat Kentico as sort of just the website. They'll put folders, they'll put page menu items, they'll put content, and that's it. They don't do anything else. But they'll create like jobs, they'll create like lists of stuff, but they create independent pages of that. And what's interesting is that a lot of people don't realize that doc types are really structured content, but they're also a table in the database. They're data, so you can actually do validation on it. You can do rules on it. You can do all sorts of behind-the-scenes stuff that allows your editors to hit new, job, fill in the blank, fill in the blank, fill in the blank. They hit save, they're done. It's very easy for them to manipulate that content, and then the presentation of that content comes back as very, very as expected. It's going to come back not jumbled, and different editors came up with different layouts and all that kind of stuff. So it forces the people to go in and keep their website clean by just simply doing some things in the doc types. So typically, if I'm importing data, I try to look at a couple of different things. Is if they have product data, well, maybe I could make a product template, a product page template, a doc type, and I could join those together, and then I could go get the Kentico import tool and look at their product database and automatically bulk import 50,000 products using that same template into the system, creating 50,000 pages that have all the content and data and pictures and everything ready to go. That same functionality can be done in the API. So you could write a task that every night at midnight goes out to a data source and pulls down all the updates and records, from Salesforce.com or something else, and actually bring that content into Kentico, rebuilding pages on the fly. So it's a very, very simple process, but a lot of people don't realize that it can't be that simple. And the other part of it is once you bring the data into Kentico as a document type, you can actually go in and manipulate that data in a way that you can use different transformations to render the presentation of that data in different ways. One news article, as you guys might as well know, can be shown 8, 10, 15 different ways on a website based on categories, taxonomy, tags, and whatnot. based on what the client wants. But in reality, it's stored one time. It's not stored a million different times. So the other cool thing about doc types is you can set up transformations and even dynamic transformations where you're using K# or C# or your own custom functions, and you can actually go in and have the data rendered back out in a transformation on the fly dynamically. You can also have a web part set up so that based on who's viewing the page, the web part goes, well, you're this guy or you're that guy if they're logged in and authenticated, and it basically could render different transformations completely based on some piece of information or custom setting on the user or a role that they're in. It's really quite easy. So if some of these best practices are followed to sort of end this, is to go in and have that capability that if you follow some of these best practices as far as templates and doc types and whatnot, you have a much easier time patching and upgrading using the Kentico installation manager, or you could do it manually. But you don't seem to have that sort of problem where the system kind of says, well, I don't want to overwrite a file that's going to cause a problem, so it stops the ability of overwriting a file, and it goes in and writes the file name .new. So then you manually, as a developer, have to go in behind the scenes after Kentico installation manager is done and either look at the log file and go find those files, or go in and find out why it detected a change, and then you have to manually update your code inside a web part or a module or some other code base. And it's kind of a pain. So I always try to teach people that if they just build it right the first time, the patches and upgrades get easy. So that's just a couple of 2 cents there. So now we're on to the Photoshop to content kind of easily. And I've done this for years. Basically, I look at the final design that's been presented in Photoshop from the client. It might have several different layers, a lot of different templates kind of in there, different looks. And I try to boil that down and see if I can look at I might even go back and look at wireframes and stuff and compare just to make sure everything looks right. But I'll start looking at, the whole thing. And so if we just separate the header footer off that content and create sort of a master page, then that master page we'll put in Kentico later. Okay, so what's left after we've taken out the header footer or the sidebar, whatever's going to be on every page, what's left is that central area of content that's important to all the users. That's where all the data is. So based on how you use settings on web parts, like show for roles or set up where clauses or even dynamic where clauses, setting up dynamic transformations using K# or a custom function, or you can alter the look based on the data. You can go in and set up different doc types that use list detail kind of situations for content. And then you can use K# and macros, which to me is kind of like one of the best secrets in the UI, is a lot of people don't realize where these guys are and how to use them. It's in the dev guide, but when you guys are working on a website and you're building out content and you pick up a web part, let me pull one up here, and you want to modify something on it, these little black triangles aren't really arrows. They're, everybody thinks that I've talked to said that they're just pointers. You can actually go in here and set these to a macro, and then based on some criteria inside the system of the current user or the current the URL or the browser that's coming in, you can actually structure some kind of command language that resets the value of any one of these fields that are set up on these web parts, and it's on every web part. So it's just a really cool thing to have the capability of doing. So once I know Kentico enough that I can break apart that Photoshop into several, instead of 60 templates, I can break it down to like 7 and a master page, something like that, then I can literally start going, okay, how do I need somebody to chop this Photoshop into different files. So before I do that, I need to see how I want to chop it up based on what's going on in the wireframes and design. So as an example, here's Southern Education Foundation. I just grabbed their site, and I start looking at where I would put web parts and how I would break this down into a header, footer, master zone kind of situation. You guys do this all the time, I'm sure. So it's just a matter of looking at the information and how to simplify it. So the second part of that kind of thing is, doing dynamic macros. So once we've broken apart the page and we know where we want to put web parts, do any of those web parts need to have, a macro, a K#? Does it have to have a custom function or a special transformation to go in and render the data out the way the client wants it? So I basically, in this example, had written we took the users list web part, And we could have gone into Studio and modified the users list web part and made a clone of it so that it would do a specific function for a certain reason or a certain user. But we figured it's actually easier to do it in the UI by setting up a where clause using a macro that basically says, are you in this role or that role, or are you part of this or part of that? And then it literally changes the transformation and the where clause to render different data back in the view for the client. So then the client either sees an ability to edit the user, or they see an ability to not edit the user simply because we did it here in the UI instead of having to write code for it. Very powerful, flexible ability that Kentico has always had. It's just amazing. It's, like I said, one of the best kept secrets I run across. So now the second step is, once you have your PSD broken down, you figure out where your web parts are going to go and your macros are going to go and how you're going to take care of stuff, it's how much time do you want your design team, your developer, to spend cutting up those pages to be perfect CSS for every browser and break apart all your images and break apart your content. How long, I've seen some groups spend a day, I've seen some spend a month just sitting there hacking apart the Photoshop into exactly the templates they want to have. And, of course, they're billing the client the whole time, which is fine. You make some money off of it. But I like to think that, time is money. And I found a couple of places on the web that I've used over the years that basically do what's called a PSD chop shop. And they literally, you send them a file, you pay them 25 to 40 bucks, and the next day you get exactly perfect slices, all your images, your layout broken apart, your content broken apart, your CSS is done. It's picture perfect, and everything's ready to go. And you only had to wait overnight or the next day. And it's just an amazing, I honestly don't know how many people work on this and how fast they do it, but it's just a trip to see it come back, within 6-7 hours, and, 7 templates are ready to go out of the box, perfect, ready to go for Kentico. So to me, it allows your team to go in and do more design and more development on maybe another project while the chop shop's actually doing some of the work. And if they're only charging 25 bucks a page to do the chop, and you guys are, you have 7 templates, it's 250 bucks, and that's it. That's far cheaper than having a designer or developer sit there and hack it apart in a single day. So one of the things is once you got that content back, and we've basically narrowed down the templates to a minimum using the first step, and then we used Affirm to do kind of our dirty work to break apart the site into manageable pieces that we want to use in Kentico. It's far less costly than it is. Typically, when they send back the content, they're going to send it back, looking like straight HTML. So as an example here, here's a straight HTML. Now they're very good about commenting too, which I found is kind of interesting. As fast as they knock this stuff out. So in this case, this particular site, we can just basically kill off the header, and we see that we've got a middle container with some social. We've got a content area, and then of course we end up with a footer at the bottom. So it's just slick, for them to come up and give you what you need. So looking at that, the third step of the 4 steps to knock this thing out really quickly is to go in and, now that you have the raw parts in a manageable form, is break it down a little bit further. As we talked about in the first step, you want to break down your master, header, footer kind of layout, but we don't want content because we're going to add the content with web parts. So we basically go into the HTML code and we knock out all the content, and I go in and put those Kentico web part zone containers, that one control that you need to actually hold a web part, and you go replace all those pieces with that. So your CSS is working, your HTML is working, you're just replacing the content. So then you do the same thing for the home page body, which is the central area that's wrapped around with the master page. You do the other page templates if you have, several of them, and you basically now have all your page templates done for the most part inside the system. You have your master, home, and several other page templates. So the next part I do is I'll bulk import images and assets into their proper areas. Now we talked about that earlier, is do we put them in the content tree, do we put them in app themes, and that's part of that education I wanted to bring to you guys, is where's the right area to put certain pieces. And so once you've placed your images, assets, and whatnot to create the design in the areas that you feel is where you want to put them, do you lock them away from the user or do you let them out? The last thing I do is copy the design CSS into Kentico. Now the trick here is that a lot of people go into the Kentico CSS, they delete the file, and they plunk in their new CSS and they're ready to go. Well, anytime a user uses a page template with a web part, that web part's CSS is no longer in that file because you changed it out for your file. So what I typically spend a little time doing is merging the Kentico CSS file with my file so that all my web parts that I plan to use on that website, all their CSS is kind of ready to go, loosely. It still needs some tweaking to be the perfect design for my site, but it's ready. It's pretty close to go. And most of this work at this stage is really just copy and paste. So again, we're not doing any studio work here, just straight portal. So the last part of this is to go in, the last part of this is go in and look at, okay, we've got the templates, we've got the CSS, we've got all the content cut up, and everything's ready to go except for actual data. And so once we've got those page templates in place, we can go in and create, we need to look at the data that we're bringing in as an import, or we need to look at the data that we're going in as a new website, what kind of data they're going to create in different areas. So I try to break down, do I need to do document types for structured content in what areas? And if I do, what page templates or what transformations do I need to create to make that data look the way it should? I also look at, did their existing website, if they had one set up, run in some other CMS? Was it in a database? Can I get to that data? Or are they running some content off of spreadsheets, literally, where they have like a list of assets on spreadsheets? And I will look at the Kentico import tool, and I will look at that data, and I have my document type created, ready to go to hold, let's say, products, and I will say, go to their products database, grab 10,000 records, pull it in, I'll line up all my fields, and I'll basically bulk import all that data into Kentico as doc types or other things. Now, the import tool really just uses the API, and you can also, if you don't have access to their data or they don't have it in the database, and there's no easy way to create it, obviously you can do it manually. We've all done that. It's a lot of copy and paste. And then the last part is looking at the various pages and adding web parts to them. So now that we've had our document types that hold the data, we want to put web parts on a page to render that data back through a presentation layer using transformations. So basically you add your web parts to your page templates, and the last real part of it is add actual content. Are there some pages that were just content, pictures, no doc types, they're just content. So at that point, you just have to do possibly some adjustments on the transformations to make it look exactly the way it needs to, possibly some CSS changes. And literally, I've used this process to go in and build from nothing, Photoshop, and that's all I have, to a Kentico site in as little as 2 to 3 weeks. Some sites I've done in 3 days, but it depends on the complexity of the site, obviously, and what their needs are at the end of the day, what the project goal is. So as long as I had a final design, ready servers, know their staff, I could go through and follow the best practices and knock this thing out and turn it over to the client in a short period of time. So that leads me to thinking about, when I was writing this up, about Kentico and how it stores CSS in a bunch of different places. We know that if you use ASPX templates, you might use a CSS file on the hard drive. If you're using a straight portal, you might have in the database that one CSS file stored for the site. But you can also now store CSS pieces for transformations and web part layouts and web part containers, shared page layouts, custom page layouts, and whatnot. So you have a lot of different CSS. But at the end of the day, the website, when it serves a page up to a browser, still serves up via HTTP, right? So I learned a long time ago, about last year, to save time and effort, is I ran across a client that showed me a tool that was called Stylizer. And the Stylizer lets you go in and visually not only see CSS, I mean, you could do that with Firebug and developer tools and whatnot, but you could actually go in and visually manipulate the CSS live in your view for multiple different browser engines, whether it's Firefox or Chrome or IE, it would render that content. So, and the way it works, if you go into, they have a demo and a trial and all that kind of fun stuff here, but Stylizer app is just really clean, and it just really works well. So if you literally open up a website, could be anybody's website, could be a broken website, that's fine. So you're always trying to fix that one CSS bug or that one browser that doesn't work. The cool thing about Stylizer is it would tell you if your CSS had warnings on it, and it would tell you what those warnings were. So you could actually see that we're missing an ending or missing a start somewhere in the file. but some warnings are okay and it lets those go. It also would show you your skin file, which, you know, it's kind of hard to see in Firebug. So if I click over here and say I want to move this logo, I can actually grab the tool and move different pieces of this page element around. I can also see what CSS is actually attached to that. And at the bottom, I can actually see the entire DOM. So if I said, I really need to create a new rule, I can actually pick a couple of these and literally make new rule and start filling in, padding and margins and literally doing what I need to manipulate this visually. So that's one cool thing. The other side of it is you can actually go in and fix bugs. If you see that one element there that just won't go away, you can't figure out that one pixel thing, it drives you nuts, and it's somewhere in the CSS. So literally I can go in here and play with that stuff on the fly. Now once I'm done, I can just hit save, and it can dump it to the computer, network, or clipboard. And so I hit save, and what it does is creates the entire Kentico CSS file is now there. I can go to Kentico's website where my CSS is stored, copy and paste it back on top of itself, and now my updates are done. So I don't have to go in and spend a long time figuring out which class, which DOM, of what menu, of what control is broken or had some weird naming convention that I couldn't go in and adjust for. So it's just a really slick tool, and I definitely recommend if you guys build a lot of websites, take a look at that. And that's really all I have. There's a couple of resources I used on this, so I wanted to put the URLs up there in case you needed it. The developer's guide for Kentico, obviously, is at that URL. The PSD chop I use and have used in the past is xhtmlchop.com. Quite a slick little site, but if you Google PSD chop, you'll find several hundred of them out there. And then Stylizer 5 is actually at stylizerapp.com.
If you find any of those tools useful or the information in this webinar, or have questions about it or Kentico, feel free to email me at neilp@kentico.com or check out our consulting at www.kentico.com/support/consulting/overview. My name is Neil Powers, and it's been a pleasure to work with you guys today.